Hi, I'm Peter Jacobs. I'm the chair of the WCPA Mountain Specialist Group. I'm based in Australia, and before I go on, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which I'm located on. Thanks for calling into this speaker's pitch today, where we're going to talk about protecting mountains and where will the next mountain protected areas come from. So why is this project important to us, and why is this topic important? Well, the Mountains Specialist Group has an objective to identify mountain areas in need of protection and indeed advocate for their protection. And that's all very well to have that objective, but how do we decide the areas that are most in need of protection, and what basis do we use to develop those priorities? So this project is really taking it beyond the talk about protecting more mountain areas and developing a tool and a process to help us determine, importantly, where those priorities are. And of course, with 30 by 30 being discussed amongst the community, it's a movement for global coverage of protected areas to be 30% by 2030 across land and sea. And again, that's all very well, but how to ensure that the most important mountain areas are protected as part of that process? So to help to support that thinking, we've developed a decision support tool to really help us determine where the priorities are for mountain protected areas in the future. This session's not designed in time to talk a lot about the values of mountains. We assume that the audience has got a good knowledge of why mountains are important and the myriad of values which mountains bring to world communities. However, what we do know in brief is that healthy mountain landscapes build resistance and resilience to climate change shocks. They also protect critical ecosystem services, which are so important to mountain communities, whether they be natural, cultural, or social. And indeed, protected and conserved mountains are a part of a nature-based solution to many of our world's problems. Now, how protected are mountains? One lens we can look through is key biodiversity areas, or KBAs. And key biodiversity areas contain a myriad of values, as you can see in that box there, around threatened biodiversity, biological processes, and outstanding ecological integrity. And these have been mapped throughout the world, and at the moment there are well over 6,000 identified KBAs in mountains. But of great concern is only 16.3% of those KBAs are fully protected. Indeed, over 40% are not protected at all, and 43% are only partially protected. So this is starting to influence our thinking around where the more important areas in mountain areas around the world that really are in need of a priority thinking for protecting them. We look at this map, it shows a slice of part of the globe, and through the centre of the slide there, we can see key biodiversity areas mapped in the landscape. So those large grey areas are generally the mountainous areas of the world. But if you focus on those red areas, these are where there are key biodiversity areas in mountains that are completely unprotected. And as you can see, there are some quite significant clusters of those throughout even just this part of the world. So it just shows the challenge that we've got to ensure we've got a comprehensive system of protecting the highest values in mountains. And work like this helps us focus where that needs to be. Another lens we can look at is mountain biomes and ecosystems to help us understand how well protected mountains are. So this work shows us that 17% of mountain areas are indeed protected, but not proportional across mountain biomes. And this pyramid shows us at the top there, we have snow and ice, which I guess people know mountains most for, actually covers only 1.2% of the mountain landscape, but indeed it's 38% protected. Whereas if we look at those important mountain grasslands, 15% of the mountainous landscape, but only 9.6% protected, and so on. You see, forest makes up 50% of the mountain's landscape, and is only 18.7% protected. So as we move towards 30%, we need to be moving in an even gradient. So we bring those hatched lines across to 30% and have a good coverage of all those important mountain biomes in terms of our mountain protected areas. In addition to that, 40% of the world's mountain ranges don't have any protected areas at all. And many of our protected areas lack that elevational distribution, which is so important. Some may just be the tops of mountains and don't include those montane forests or grasslands. So there are lots of challenges in terms of getting a comprehensive system of protecting mountain values across the world. So the project aim here is to identify key biodiversity areas and ecosystems within the world's mountains that are poorly protected as a starting point. We then, based on that, rank the importance of those by considering other important values, which I'll talk about shortly. That'll help identify priorities to advocate for protected or conserved area status. And to do that, we'll need to establish partners to focus that advocacy. This work's going to be so important as we move towards 30 by 30. So we've developed a 6-step decision support tool, which helps determine where those priorities are going to be. The first step in that process is to identify poorly protected mountain KBAs. And we currently have some good data on this. And in fact, that data is built in to the decision support tool, into the data bank. So you can see anywhere across the world, the extent of KBAs and the level of protection those KBAs have. We then need to identify appropriate countries for advocacy. And sadly, at the moment, there are countries which it wouldn't be appropriate to be advocating for mountain protected areas. So we need to focus where the efforts are going to be. The third important step is to validate the protection and conservation status. We know that the World Database of Protected Areas is not entirely accurate, and there may well be other effective conservation measures in place that are giving adequate protection to some of these KBAs. So it's important for that local knowledge to understand that the conservation status is correct. We then look at ranking the priority mountain KBAs by importance for protection, and that's based on 10 other factors, which we'll discuss shortly. The fifth step is to look at where those mountain KBAs fit into biodiversity hotspots. That gives a real indication strategically of the areas that are most at risk and of the highest value. And lastly, to look at where those KBAs occur in developing countries so that we can help work through the process of advocacy. So that then leads to giving us 9 categories. So all those over 6,000 KBAs are put into one of those 9 categories, and 4 of those categories are for action. Those that fall into the other 5 categories at this stage don't require the priority action. So an important part of the process is to go through that ranking process of KBAs, and that can really only be done by an in-country regional assessment of those poorly protected mountain KBAs and ecosystems by experts in those areas. So once we've developed the broad priorities based on data that's readily available globally, we then go through an assessment process and rank those KBAs. So some of the factors that will be looked at through this is, are there poorly protected mountain ecosystems within those KBAs? Does the KBA enhance connectivity conservation? Are there flagship or iconic species or ecological communities within those KBAs? Are there red list threatened species and ecosystems? Does the KBA represent a range of elevation gradients? And do the KBAs provide benefits to mountain communities such as ecosystem services or indeed ecotourism? Does the KBA also add to the protection of cultural sites, cultural heritage and cultural landscapes? Does the KBA contribute to peace building across borders? Does the KBA have vulnerability to climate change or indeed assist mitigation of climate change? And lastly, does the KBA have a role in disaster risk reduction? So those 10 factors are built into the priority KBAs, and they help to rank those KBAs in terms of, again, their importance for advocating for their protection. Looking at a case study at how this might work, we looked at the Indian Himalayan area and did a detailed study of KBAs and ecosystems across that landscape and across those states. What we found was that across those states, there are 58 mountain key biodiversity areas, but 22 of those are what we'd call poorly protected. And of those 22, about 20 also had poorly protected world ecosystems. So therefore, it's really starting to focus on where the highest priority for protection really does sit. And of course, being in the Himalaya, all those KBAs also sit within the Himalayan biodiversity hotspot. So we mapped those across that landscape, across those Indian Himalayan states. You can see there the ones with those red infill are showing where there's poor protection of certain mountain ecosystems. And where the outside border is either red or orange, it's also showing that the KBA is poorly protected. So this really shows us where we can focus. And up in the top left-hand corner there, for example, you can see an area that's poorly protected in terms of its mountain ecosystem, and this also has poor protection in terms of the key biodiversity areas within it. So starting to really show a focus for where we need to advocate for protection and start to build priorities. So in summary, we know that healthy mountain landscapes are critical for global health. We also know that mountains are extreme risk, particularly from climate change. We also know that mountain biodiversity is complex, and importantly, that it's not evenly protected. And we need to consider that important when we're looking at priorities for protecting mountain biodiversity. This decision support tool assists with the identification of mountain areas in need of protection, but it's important that we have that regional and local input to validate and help rank the importance of those areas. So the Mountains Specialist Group hopes to roll this out within regions to really start to identify where those priority areas are for protection. So the next steps, you can go to our WCPA Mountains webpage, where the paper and the decision support tool is loaded on there. And you can see that a lot of data is already loaded into that decision support tool in regard to particularly key biodiversity areas and mountain ecosystems. I'd certainly welcome any feedback. There are a number of co-authors on this paper and on this decision support tool. So on behalf of all the co-authors, I'd be very happy to have any feedback. You can see the email address there for any feedback. This process will inform over the next few years input into 30 by 30 and where priorities are for mountain protection. And also importantly, if you're interested in helping out with this process or have ideas on the application, we'd be very pleased to hear from you. So that's important to get some feedback. And lastly, I'd just like to acknowledge the data that we've managed to gather and the help with this process. The UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Centre has provided important information on protected areas through the WDPA. BirdLife International has provided important information on the level of protection of key biodiversity areas. And the United States Geological Survey have also provided some really important work on the level of protection of mountain ecosystems. So some great data out there to use. Mapping it and designing it into a tool has been a really crucial part of this process, and we're hoping that it will take us forward on some really good strategic approach to how we manage our mountain protected areas into the future. So thanks for listening. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, and all the best and keep safe.